Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Jack Malday, Senior Policy Analyst at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In this week's episode, BPC Senior Advisor Theresa Cardinal chats with Mark Hetfield, President and CEO at HIAS, and Claire Holba, an Immigration Policy Fellow at the Niskanen Center, about the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. HIAS, founded as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, is a Jewish-American non-profit organization that provides humanitarian aid and assistance to refugees from around the world. Through his role leading the organization, Mark tells us about the experience and challenges of refugee resettlement agencies on the ground, as the world is experiencing the largest displacement of people since World War II. The Niskanen Center is a DC-based policy think tank, and Claire, in her role as Immigration Policy Fellow, has been looking at the status of the US Refugee Admissions Program and how it is making a comeback from the end of the Trump administration, which saw the lowest number of refugees resettled in the program's history. Stay tuned for this vital discussion.
With increasing displacement due to factors such as conflict and climate change, the operation of the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is vital. Our guests this week bring an understanding of the experiences refugee resettlement agencies face on the ground, as well as the data surrounding the effectiveness of and challenges facing the program. First, we welcome Mark Hetfield, who is President and CEO at HIAS. Mark first joined HIAS in 1989 as a caseworker in Rome, Italy, and he has worked for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, a large law firm as an immigration attorney, and has held multiple roles at HIAS over the years before taking the helm of that organization. So needless to say, he's an expert on all of this stuff. So welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Thank you, Theresa.
Next, we have Claire Holba, who's an Immigration Policy Fellow at the Niskanen Center. Claire conducts research on solutions to protracted refugee situations, border ecosystems, human rights, and education in a displacement context, with particular geographic focus on Southeast Asia. She also sits on the board of multiple NGOs providing unique business and accounting perspectives from her time spent working for top 4 accounting firm, Ernst & Young in New York City. She has written for the Niskanen Center some reports on the data on the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. So Claire, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Theresa. It's great to be here.
So to kick us off, Mark, tell us what the Refugee Resettlement Program is for those listeners that may not know much about it and how it works.
Sure. U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program is a way that the United States selects refugees who need protection or need a durable solution who are outside of the United States and brings them here to give them safety and a pathway to a green card and citizenship.
So what role does HIAS and other organizations like yours play in that program?
It's a private-public partnership, and there are 10 agencies like HIAS. 7 of us are faith-based. HIAS represents the Jewish community. We're the Jewish community's refugee resettlement agency. And we have roles on both sides of the ocean. We help identify refugees who are in need of resettlement. We also assist with their processing and their refugee applications when they're overseas. And then once they come to the United States, our partners around the country greet them at the airport upon arrival, bring them to their new home, furnish that home, and also get them acclimated to their new life, help them find work, get their children enrolled in school, and basically get them on a pathway to becoming an American citizen.
Yeah. So you mentioned it's a public-private partnership. So the government is the one that actually determines that somebody's a refugee, and they then how do you get your support? Is it private sources? Is it government sources? How does HIAS work with the government on this?
It's both. For example, the State Department gives each agency a little over $1,000 per refugee to cover our costs and a little over $1,000 per refugee to cover the assistance that they need. That doesn't nearly cover expenses of rent, furniture, food, and services that those refugees need. So we invariably need to raise private resources to supplement that.
Yeah.
And I'll also say it's interesting, and hopefully this will be changing soon, but right now it's a one-size-fits-all approach. So whether we resettle somebody in San Francisco, San Diego, or Toledo, we get the same amount of funding from the federal government.
Yeah, and the costs in those places are going to be very different. So this
Correct.
brings us, I mean, to some of the challenges you face is funding and the challenges are there. But what are some of the other challenges faced by organizations such as yours in providing these services?
Well, the biggest challenge is trying to make sure that the refugees actually arrive. We have no control over that, obviously, and for many years, the refugee ceiling has been much higher than the number of refugees who arrive.
Mm.
That creates a lot of problems for us. Family reunification is very clumsy and inefficient right now. There are refugees who are resettled who have to wait literally years to get their spouses or their children under 21 processed, which is absolutely inexcusable. So that's another frustration that we have long had to endure. And the other thing is the program has become very politicized, and therefore it has its ups and downs. And we have to spend a lot of time defending the program, whereas it used to have a lot of bipartisan support.
Yeah. So speaking of that, during the Trump administration, the refugee program was reduced substantially, with the last year of that administration having a ceiling of 15,000, which was, I think, the lowest it had ever been set. How did that impact the work that you and the other organizations like yours do? And what has it been like since?
It was devastating, frankly. When Obama left office, the refugee ceiling was 110,000. That's set by the president every year. In Trump's first full year in office, he lowered it to 45 and then 30, and then, as you said, 15,000. And so we had to, in turn, fire staff, close offices, close programs all over the country. There were 300 refugee resettlement sites when Trump took office. By the time he left, there were less than 200, and those 200 that remained really had a skeleton crew of staff. So it really just eviscerated our capacity to resettle refugees, which was really problematic when all of a sudden the United States, when Biden took office, had to evacuate 85,000 Afghans into the US. And even though they didn't come through the Refugee Resettlement Program, they still relied on the same infrastructure.
Yeah. So, Claire, you have been looking at recent data around the resettlement program, noting that 2023 saw the largest number of resettlements since the Trump era. Um, and 2024 seems to be starting out pretty good as well. Tell us more about these numbers and what you found.
Yes, absolutely. There's good news to report here, I think. So in 2023, over 60,000 refugees arrived in the US. For context, the number of refugees who arrived in 2022 was at only about 25,000. So the number of refugee arrivals more than doubled between 2022 and 2023. And 2024 is on pace to far outmatch last year. We're only one quarter into fiscal year 2024, and on average, about 7,500 refugees are being resettled each month. I think we can expect that average to grow over the next 2 quarters, but even if this rate continues as is, the US RAP could resettle upwards of 90,000 refugees in 2024. This would be the highest number of refugees resettled in any year in the 21st century. And what makes this remarkable is that the program, that is the necessary infrastructure, it successfully operated on, had to be rebuilt, as Mark alluded to as well. And I know you'll ask me more about that later.
Yeah. Well, let's ask a little bit more about where the refugees are coming from.
Mhm.
Have there been many changes? So, Mark alluded that every year the president makes a determination of the ceiling of the number of refugees the United States wants to settle. And within that ceiling, there are like sub goals, if you will, for different regions of the world. I know the Biden administration made a point in this last year of increasing the resettlement from the Western Hemisphere. Have we seen that pay off? Are we seeing more folks from the Western Hemisphere, or there's been a change in where people are coming from?
Yes, so there have been some notable changes in countries where refugees are coming from, as well as similar trends to what the program has seen in the past. Just to talk about trends that we've seen over the last couple of years. So the majority of refugees who arrived last year were from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Burma, also known as Myanmar. Refugees from Burma, they've been in the top 5 nationalities resettled over the last 5 years that have refugees from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then we've also seen last year and this year as well, refugees from Syria and Afghanistan consistently being resettled. So the biggest change in the nationalities of refugees arriving in the U.S. Has been from the region you alluded to, Latin America and the Caribbean. Last year, only about 6,300 refugees were resettled from this region. And so far in 2024, the pace is set to at least double that, though there are indicators that numbers might be much higher than just doubling those of last year. And that's because, as you mentioned, part of the administration's 2023 resettlement goals were to triple the number of refugees resettled from this region. That commitment continued into this year when the arrival ceiling was lifted from 15,000 in 2023 to a goal of resettling upwards of 50,000 refugees from the region, Latin America and the Caribbean this year.
Mm-hmm. So, Mark, do those data reflect the experience that HIAS has seen on the ground? And are there areas of the world that your organization focuses more on or less?
It shifts like the program, but as Claire said, we have a big focus now, as does the program in Latin America. Resettling a lot of Venezuelans at the moment, which is new, and apparently that's going quite successfully. But also the Democratic Republic of the Congo, um, people who have the Rohingya who fled Burma, Somalis continue to be resettled, Sudanese. So it continues to be. I mean, there really is a worldwide refugee crisis going on. So refugees are coming from all corners of the world.
Can you talk a little bit more about where refugees go in the United States? You mentioned that there were 200 refugee offices. Now maybe you've back up now, but where are these people being resettled?
Right. And we being the 10 agencies, including HIAS, actually have opened or reopened in almost all the places where we've closed. And the number of resettlement sites is now even greater than it was when Trump came into office. So we have built back, which is great. The problem is during those 4 years of the Trump administration, we never talked about how to improve the program. It was always how to save the program,
Right.
how to protect the program. But they're resettled all over the country, and it really is. PRM tries to make sure that they are resettled in the Refugee Bureau at State Department tries to make sure the refugees are resettled in all 50 states.
Are there states that are receiving certain populations more than others? Or, we hear about Arab Somalis in Detroit, for example, and other places. What's the welcome like in those communities?
Yeah, we make a real effort to make sure that wherever we resettle refugees are places where they're going to stay. We have to make sure because otherwise it's a wasted investment in time and resources and frankly emotionally for the refugee and for the volunteers and the staff who support them. It's really important that we put refugees in places where they're going to stay. And so, like you said, there are many Somali refugees have communities in Minneapolis or Columbus, Ohio, or Lewiston, Maine. So they're often resettled in those cities. Afghans have very high preferences for cities like Sacramento and San Diego, so much so that they had to put restrictions on those on Sacramento in particular, because there were so many Afghans that wanted to be resettled there. So we do have to try to distribute them, but the bottom line is that the refugees are going to go where they want to go. So it's really important that we make sure that we put them in a place where they're going to be happy and want to stay.
And I assume that you're looking for places that have networks of volunteers, that have jobs available, that that they can find, as you mentioned, support from their own or similar communities. Are those some of the criteria you look for as well?
Absolutely, but I will tell you that the issue that keeps our resettlement directors awake all night, every night, is the cost of
Housing.
housing. That has become the number one issue, and especially as I said, Afghans, because of where their communities are, tend to gravitate toward these much higher rent areas like San Diego and Sacramento and Northern Virginia. So it's a real challenge for us, and it's frankly the biggest challenge. The Biden administration, to be frank, it was very difficult for us this year because they declared a quota of 125,000 refugees, and the resettlement agency said we can't do it. We can't get to 125,000 because of the cost of housing. So we're trying really hard to figure out how we can resolve that issue. even this year, because the fact is that they have now gotten the program efficient enough that they could actually resettle 125,000 if we had the domestic capacity to accept them.
Mhm.
Jobs are not an issue right now, right? We can get refugees to work very, very quickly because of the economy, and because the economy needs immigrants and refugees, because there aren't enough American citizens or American residents to fill all the open jobs that there are.
Yeah. Well, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll delve deeper into other recent changes to the resettlement program as well as its future prospects. So don't go anywhere. Claire, you've also written a bit about other improvements the program has seen, such as policy innovations and technological breakthroughs, investments in personnel. What have been some of the most notable developments in the program that you are noticing at the Niskanen Center?
Yes, lots to talk about here, and it's been exciting and really hopeful to watch the improvements that have been made. We saw improvements being made to the pipeline through several critical indicators. USCIS was hiring more refugee corps staff, and they conducted more than 5 times as many circuit rides in 2022 than in 2021. Circuit
I'm going
rides
to
are
pause right there just for members that listeners don't understand. So USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services,
yes.
refugee personnel are the ones that go out into the world and interview potential refugees to determine if they qualify as a refugee. And then if they do, then they get resettled, correct?
Exactly, exactly. It's a critical step in the US RAP process where, as you mentioned, teams of USCIF refugee officers and support staff go abroad to conduct these interviews with refugee applicants to make sure that they meet the US legal definition of a refugee.
Yeah. So we have to have those interviews happening if we're going to have people to resettle. So the buildup, as you said, the pipeline of people ready to be resettled. Got it.
Yes, absolutely. So increasing these circuit rides led to 33,000 more interviews with refugee applicants than in 2022 than in the previous year, 2021. As you mentioned, without refugee officers, you can't adjudicate refugee claims. So building back agency capacity by hiring refugee officers and sending them overseas, it was critical. We saw these growth indicators continuing into fiscal year 2023. And so it was only a matter of time before the monthly refugee arrival numbers reflected all of this significant work being put into the pipeline on the back end. And then March 2023 was when we finally saw this breakthrough, which was very exciting. So between February and March of 2023, the arrival number doubled. This wasn't a one off event, as arrival numbers consistently stayed above 6,000 for the remainder of 2023. And now in 2024, the monthly average is at about 7,500 refugees per month. So I'd like to also highlight another improvement to the US RAP pipeline with exciting potential concurrent processing sites. In fiscal year 2023, USCIS piloted these sites to reduce the time it takes to process refugees for arrival through the pipeline, essentially just by creating efficiencies in the processing. The goal was to get this processing time down to 6 months. And as of now, there are concurrent processing sites in 14 countries. So this is another exciting innovation that was implemented into the US RAP.
And just for comparison, for many years, the refugee process was taking well over 18 months to get people from start to finish. So this is a huge improvement into processing time.
Yes, yes. And it's not clear necessarily what if that processing time is at 6 months yet, but that is the goal. And I think that's exciting in and of itself.
Yeah. So, Mark, do you think that these changes the Biden administration made has helped? I mean, you mentioned not having enough capacity to resettle everybody they have in the pipeline, but what other things would you think might be done, and what might help the program more?
No, the changes are absolutely amazing, long overdue. They finally realized that they can actually do a lot of the steps in refugee processing at the same time rather than consecutively. And that has made the process just incredibly much more efficient. As I said earlier, one thing I would prioritize is the processing of immediate relative applications for refugees and asylees. There's no ownership of that, and so every time we fix a problem at USCIS, then it breaks down at the National Visa Center, and then you fix that, then it breaks down at the consulates. So that definitely needs to be fixed so that people can reunite with their spouses and with their children. There's no excuse for that issue. The other issue right now is that HIAS resettles refugees from, for example, from Iran, who are Iranian religious minorities. They're brought to Austria for processing, and that relies on something called the Lautenberg Amendment, which expires every year. The Lautenberg Amendment is basically an assurance to a transit country that that the United States will take the refugees from that country, that it invites to that country for refugee adjudication. But as I said, it expires every year, and this year, for the first time, the House Judiciary Committee is refusing to allow its reauthorization in the appropriations legislation, should Congress ever
Past that,
pass an
yeah.
appropriation legislation. So it's that kind of a frustration that we are facing. And also, just frankly, the misinformation that goes out about the refugee program. A lot of people who are skeptics about immigration will say that they're in favor of immigration and asylum, but only for people who wait in line. And the Refugee Resettlement Program is actually a
Yeah.
line. Like it is an orderly process for bringing people here who need protection. So there is absolutely no reason to oppose it. And when you do oppose it, or when you do create bottlenecks or prevent things like the Lautenberg Amendment from getting extended, you're promoting other ways to get here other than legal immigration, because people are desperate.
Well, I was going to ask you next, like how the migrant situation on the border has impacted the refugee work of your organization. You mentioned, for example, the Afghan evacuation, which used all of the same processes of refugee, even though they didn't arrive as refugees. We now have the process of asylum seekers at the border who don't benefit from your services because they're coming on their own. But has your organization been assisting with them at all as they arrive in some of the cities where they're going to? And has that impacted your refugee work? You also mentioned, I think, the political dynamic of how one might impact the other, if you want to address any of those.
Yeah, no, we do all those things. HIAS does much more than refugee resettlement. We actually are partners with the UN Refugee Agency in Mexico, and give people there assistance, both mental health, psychosocial services, as well as legal assistance, either to apply for asylum in Mexico or to understand the process in the United States. So we do work in those areas, and we also have a big presence throughout Latin America, where there are these new refugee processing centers known as SMOs, where Venezuelans, for example, and other nationalities are being processed as refugees. We also have a role in that. And we also operate in these cities, or either directly, as in New York City, or through our partners, as in San Diego, where we assist the asylum seekers who come there and need services or need assistance with employment authorization and other
Yeah.
things.
So you mentioned these SMOs, the safe mobility offices that were set up just in this last year by the State Department in, I think, now we're 4 or 5 countries in Latin America. Claire, I think I saw that Niskanen had written a little bit about the success of those offices. Do you have any information about how those have been going?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Theresa, SMOs are currently in 4 countries in Latin America, and they're prioritizing the referrals to the US rep and also working to build efficiencies in processing times, which can hopefully help support this 50,000 refugee goal from the region and hopefully exceed that as well.
Yeah. We talked about it a little bit when Title 42 was taken down. This is one of the things that the government did to try to redirect people from coming to the border. But, they hit, as I recall, they hit capacity for the initial application processes pretty quickly. But now we're starting to see people actually being processed through that and arriving in the United States. So eventually these things do take off and grow.
And another innovation that I have left out is, of course, the launch of the Welcome Corps,
Mm.
which is a private sponsorship program where groups of 5 Americans can join together and sponsor a refugee or refugee household either by being matched with a household or by sponsoring someone that they know. There's also been a special program for colleges and universities, Welcome Corps on campus. And so, the addition of these new players into the national resettlement infrastructure presents the possibility of creating really a more robust, resilient, integrated infrastructure of welcoming. So this has been a really great innovation and addition to our USRAP program. Friday was the 1-year anniversary of the Welcome Corps, and so far more than 15,000 Americans across 32 states applied to sponsor more than 7,000 refugees.
So it's getting set up. I know that this is a program that Canada has had private refugee sponsorship for a long time, and the United States used to have it, and then we didn't have it for a long time. So it's coming back. I remember when I was little, and I'm pretty old now, that our church sponsored a refugee family way back in the day. So I know that existed. Well, let me ask you both sort of, how do you feel about the prospects of the program going forward? And are you optimistic things will continue to improve, or are there, danger signs that you're cautious about?
Well, Theresa, how's the election going to turn out in November?
Okay, Mark, go ahead.
I mean, that's honestly the answer to this question, which is sad because I've been in this business for a long, long time, since the Reagan administration, I'm embarrassed to say. And there was never a dramatic change in the way resettled refugees were treated from administration to administration, between Republican and Democratic administration. Some of our most ardent supporters of refugee resettlement were Republicans for many, many years. And as you know, the Refugee Act in 1980 passed almost unanimously in the Senate and nearly unanimously in the House of Representatives, strong bipartisan support. And since November 2015, really, it has become an extremely polarized program. So everything for this program will depend upon the election.
Yeah.
And I don't need to tell you what will happen depending on who is elected.
Well,
the choice is obvious.
We don't know the outcome of the Republican primary yet, but there is a large potential that the election will be between the two most recent presidents, and that would make a big deal. Well, I want to thank you both for joining us on the podcast today. If people need to find you, Mark, where does the best way for them to contact HIAS?
Through our website, HIAS.org.
HIAS.org. And Claire, at NiskanenCenter.org?
Yes, or my personal email is fine. You can find that on the Niskanen website too.
Right. So thank you both for joining us and for this discussion of the refugee program and its prospects. Really appreciate you being on This Week in Immigration.
Thanks, Theresa.
Thank you, Theresa.
And that's a wrap on this episode of This Week in Immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. I am also excited to announce that our podcast episodes are now available to listen to on YouTube, so please check us out on the Bipartisan Policy Center YouTube channel. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. You can follow the Bipartisan Policy Center on the X platform at BPC_bipartisan. You can follow Theresa Cardinal Brown at BPC_T Brown. And you can follow me at Jack Malday. Send your comments and feedback to us by email to immigration@bipartisanpolicy.org. I'm Jack Malday. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This episode was written by myself and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Joshua Joe is our audio editor. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Lucy Manning. Talk to you next time on This Week in Immigration.